I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all, it was this magnificent desolation.
At 89 years old, Apollo astronaut Charles Duke is finally breaking his silence about what he witnessed on the moon. And it's not the story you've been told. Duke's legacy is unlike any other. He's the man who guided Neil Armstrong's first step from mission control. The reassuring Southern voice millions heard live. And later, he became the youngest human to leave footprints on the lunar surface. After decades of silence, watching Apollo 16 fade into the background of history, Duke is ready to share the truth as he saw it. But the question is, what has NASA overlooked for more than half a century? The man behind the voice. Before Charles Duke ever touched lunar dust, the world already knew his voice. On July 20th, 1969, as Armstrong piloted the Eagle toward the surface, millions of people were glued to their televisions, hearing Duke's calm but tense Southern drawl from Mission Control in Houston. When Armstrong announced, "The Eagle has landed," it was Duke who famously replied, "Roger, tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." That single line etched him into history before his boots ever touched the moon. But unlike Armstrong or Aldrin, Duke wasn't given parades, magazine covers, or global recognition. He was the invisible astronaut, the guardian behind the scenes. As Capcom, the capsule communicator, Duke was the lifeline between Earth and space. Every word he spoke carried the weight of millions listening. Any hesitation, any mistake, could mean disaster. For Apollo 11, failure wasn't an option. Duke delivered under pressure, guiding the most dangerous landing in human history with a steady hand. But that role came with a strange psychological burden. Imagine being the voice that carried humanity's greatest leap, but not being the one taking it. Duke later admitted the tension never left him. He wasn't just relaying instructions, he was living the mission through others, aching to be there himself. That dual perspective shaped everything that followed. Years later, when he finally walked on the moon during Apollo 16, he carried both roles with him, the voice of mission control and the footsteps of an explorer. No other astronaut in history had that double vision. For decades, his story remained overshadowed by bigger names and louder headlines. Now, before time runs out, Charles Duke wants to set the record straight. Because what he saw on the moon didn't match the polished images NASA showed the world. And what he reveals now changes how we remember Apollo forever. The stark reality of the lunar surface. When Charles Duke finally descended the ladder of the lunar module during Apollo 16, he expected the moon to look exactly as training had prepared him for: a dead, gray wasteland. But the moment his visor cleared the shadow of the lander, he realized nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead. The first shock wasn't the ground. It was the sky, or rather, the lack of it. On Earth, no matter how dark the night gets, the sky always has texture. A glow. Stars. The faint suggestion of atmosphere. On the moon, Duke found none of that. Above his helmet stretched an emptiness so absolute that he later described it as a black so deep you felt like you could fall into it forever. This was not the gentle darkness of night. It was a void, an abyss swallowing everything. And against that infinite blackness blazed a surface so bright it nearly hurt his eyes through the visor. The contrast was staggering. Every rock, every shadow looked carved with a knife. The moon wasn't soft gray, like the photos had suggested. It was sharp, alien, and utterly unforgiving. No camera has ever captured what Duke saw. The technology of the time flattened the extremes. Photographs showed a dull monochrome, but to the human eye, the moon was violent in its contrasts, blinding whites against absolute blacks. To Duke, it felt less like standing on another world and more like standing inside a painting too harsh for human senses. And then came the disappointment. The image most people picture when they think of the moon, the Earth rising majestically over the horizon, was nowhere to be seen. Apollo 16 had landed in the Descartes Highlands, with Earth hanging directly overhead, invisible through the rigid helmet design. Duke tried craning his neck, hoping for a glimpse of the blue marble suspended in the void, but all he saw was the opaque lining of his visor. He later admitted that the irony haunted him. The most poetic image in pop culture, the Earthrise, was something he never actually saw. While millions imagined astronauts gazing at their home planet with tears in their eyes, Duke spent his mission staring at rocks and shadows, cut off from the very sight he had dreamed of for years. This was the first crack in the myth. The moon wasn't the postcard humanity had been sold. It wasn't serene. It wasn't romantic. It was stark, brutal, and isolating. The suits only made the alienation worse. Imagine wearing a fishbowl on your head with a field of view that cuts off everything but what's directly in front of you. No peripheral vision, no sweeping vistas. If you wanted to look sideways, you had to twist your entire body like a machine. What should have been the ultimate panorama felt more like peering through a tunnel. Even movement was strange. In 1/6 gravity, Duke described every step as both exhilarating and clumsy. Small jumps felt effortless, but every stumble risked disaster. Fall too hard, and the fragile life support backpack could crack open like glass. Survival meant balancing awe with constant fear. And yet, within all that harshness, Duke experienced something profound. He later confessed that the visual violence of the moon, the razor-sharp shadows, the abyssal sky, the glaring light, left him with an almost spiritual sense of insignificance. It wasn't another desert, he said. It wasn't another mountain range. It was something that didn't care if we existed or not. That was the revelation he carried for decades. The moon wasn't humanity's neighbor. It was an alien frontier that made every living thing feel fragile, small, and temporary. And that's why Duke is speaking now. Because history, NASA's PR campaigns, and Hollywood movies have polished the moon into a symbol of beauty. In truth, it was terrifying. But visuals were only half the story. What Duke and John Young did during those 71 hours on the lunar surface, the experiments, the discoveries, the science, was just as groundbreaking. And yet, Apollo 16's triumphs remain largely forgotten. So the question becomes, what did they accomplish out there? And why does Duke insist it matters more now than ever? Apollo 16's overlooked discoveries. When people talk about Apollo, they almost always jump to the same highlights. Apollo 11, the first step. Apollo 13, the near disaster. Apollo 17, the last hurrah. But tucked in the middle, almost forgotten, sits Apollo 16. And that eats at Charles Duke. Because in his mind, Apollo 16 wasn't just another mission. It was one of the most scientifically important landings ever attempted. The world remembers Armstrong's boot print pressed into lunar dust, but hardly anyone remembers what Duke and John Young built on that barren plain. the first astronomical observatory ever placed on another world. Yes, you heard that right. Apollo 16 carried a far ultraviolet telescope, set up by hand, anchored directly into the moon's surface. From that position, free of atmosphere, it captured light invisible from Earth. For the first time in human history, we were staring into the universe from a platform untouched by air or distortion. Duke called it a window into the stars, a scientific milestone that most textbooks barely mention. And that was only the beginning. Apollo 16 lasted 71 hours, nearly 3 full days, longer than most other missions. That time gave Duke and Young a chance to push the boundaries further than anyone before. They weren't sightseeing. They were working, hammering rocks, drilling cores, and driving the lunar rover across 16 miles of alien terrain. By the end, they had collected 209 pounds of lunar samples. Not just dust, but some of the most geologically diverse material ever retrieved from the moon. Those rocks told a story scientists are still unraveling today. They revealed clues about the moon's volcanic past, the violence of impacts, and the chemistry of a world frozen in time. Decades later, researchers are still analyzing fragments Duke carried home in sample bags, finding insights that reshape theories of how the moon, and by extension, Earth itself, came to be. But Duke insists the most important discoveries came from the instruments they hauled along. Apollo 16 carried X-ray and gamma-ray spectrometers, tools that mapped the chemical composition of the moon with precision no one thought possible at the time. Suddenly, scientists weren't guessing. They had proof: fingerprints of titanium, magnesium, iron, scattered across the highlands. The data forced geologists to rethink the moon's origins, its structure, even its connection to Earth's early history. And yet, you almost never hear about it. Instead, documentaries recycle Armstrong's first step, Aldrin's salute, or Lovell's desperate radio calls from Apollo 13. Apollo 16, one of the richest in scientific achievement, gets reduced to a footnote. That frustration has stayed with Duke. He's said more than once that Apollo 16 deserves better. That the risks they took, the endless planning, the dangers of an untested Highland landing, were for discoveries that shaped science, not just spectacle. Still, even in the middle of all that science, Duke was human. He and John Young found ways to lighten the tension. During one break, they held what Duke jokingly called the Lunar Olympics. In 1/6 gravity, they tried high jumps. Duke went soaring higher than expected, lost balance, and crashed onto his back. His life support pack slammed into the ground. If it had cracked, the mission would have ended in tragedy. Later, he admitted it was stupid, but it reminded them they were still men, not robots. Even that memory carries weight, because it shows how thin the line really was. One stumble, one broken suit, and Apollo 16 would have been remembered not for science, but for disaster. And yet, Duke insists the mission's legacy isn't in the risks or even the records. It's in the data. Some of those measurements are still being reanalyzed today, nearly half a century later. In a very real sense, Apollo 16 never ended. Its work is still alive in labs across the globe. That's why Duke has become more outspoken in his final years. He doesn't just want to reminisce, he wants to defend Apollo 16's place in history. Because if one of NASA's most productive missions can fade into obscurity, then what happens when people start questioning whether it even happened at all? Fighting the deniers, Duke's final mission. By the time Charles Duke reached his late 80s, he realized he had taken on a mission he never signed up for, defending the truth of the moon landings, not from rival nations, not from politicians, but from ordinary people who claimed it was all a hoax. Imagine the irony. A man who spent 3 days walking on the lunar surface now finds himself standing in front of strangers who tell him to his face, "You never went." Duke admits it frustrates him more than almost anything else, because for him, Apollo isn't a distant memory. It's something etched into his bones. He guided Armstrong and Aldrin from Houston. He drove the lunar rover across alien ground. He carried rocks still sitting in laboratories today. And yet, 50 years later, people with no experience, no evidence, tell him it never happened. At one public event, a man confronted him with the familiar lines, the flag waving in photos, the shadows at odd angles, the missing stars in the sky. Duke didn't explode. He didn't storm off. He looked the man dead in the eye and said calmly, "Sir, I was there." That's it. 4 words. But they carried a weight no conspiracy theory could erase. Because Duke doesn't argue from theory. He argues from memory. He describes the 1/6 gravity that made every movement feel like slow-motion ballet. He recalls the silence when he cut his comms, so total it pressed against his ears. He remembers the sharp smell of lunar dust clinging to his suit, gritty and metallic, sticking to every seam. Details no hoaxer could invent, because they were lived, not staged. And he points to the proof that still exists today. 800 pounds of lunar rocks spread across research centers worldwide. Rocks with isotopes and textures no Earth geology can replicate. Rocks that only a journey across 240,000 miles of space could deliver. But what makes Duke's defense so unique is his perspective. He isn't just a moonwalker. He was also the voice of Apollo 11, the Capcom who brought Armstrong down safely. He is both the guardian from Earth and the explorer on the moon. No one else alive holds both titles. That dual credibility makes his testimony nearly untouchable. And he knows it. That's why, even as his health slows him, he leans into interviews, lectures, and podcasts. He doesn't want the truth buried under memes, YouTube conspiracies, or internet denial. He's admitted openly. He feels a responsibility to keep Apollo real, not just for his generation, but for the grandchildren who will grow up hearing more noise than fact. When asked why he keeps telling the same stories, his answer is simple. Because one day soon, there will be no one left to tell them. And if the last voices of Apollo go silent, then the doubters win. So he keeps speaking, calmly, firmly, truthfully. Because for Charles Duke, the fight is no longer about the moon, it's about memory and protecting one of humanity's greatest achievements from fading into doubt. The clock is ticking. Legacy and mortality. Charles Duke doesn't sugarcoat it anymore. Out of the 12 men who once walked on the moon, only 4 remain alive. He is one of them. That number hangs over him like a countdown clock. Every year, he watches obituaries roll in. Alan Bean, Gene Cernan, John Young. Legends gone. And with each passing, the weight on his shoulders grows heavier. Because when they're all gone, Apollo will no longer be living memory. It will be history on a page, subject to revision, distortion, even denial. Duke has admitted that thought keeps him up at night. He knows the world is moving fast, that younger generations scroll past Apollo clips like just another piece of vintage footage. To them, It's ancient history, like the Wright brothers or Magellan's voyages. But to him, it's yesterday. It's still alive in his muscles, his scars, his memories of silence under an alien sky. That's why, in his late 80s, Duke has become more vocal than ever. He's taken interviews he once turned down. He's visited classrooms, museums, podcasts, anywhere he can find a microphone. Because he believes details matter. The feel of the dust, the weight of the suit, the strange stillness of a world without air. These are things no textbook will ever capture. And if he doesn't pass them on now, they'll vanish with him. At the South Carolina State Museum, Duke spoke to a group of wide-eyed students. He told them walking on the moon wasn't about planting a flag or beating the Soviets. It was about expanding human possibility, proving we could go further than anyone imagined. He wanted them to see themselves as the next explorers, the ones who would take humanity beyond even the moon. And there's one more thing he talks about now that he rarely mentioned before: mortality. At nearly 90, Duke knows his days are numbered. He has spoken openly about wanting his grandchildren and their generation to inherit a story that's clear and untangled. He doesn't want them to inherit conspiracy theories or blurry myths or half-remembered documentaries. He wants them to know Apollo as it truly was: dangerous, awe-inspiring, fragile, and real. That urgency bleeds into his voice now. He doesn't talk like a man reliving glory days. He talks like a man racing against time, desperate to pass the torch before the flame dies. And for him, that torch isn't just Apollo, it's the future. Because Duke insists Apollo was never the finish line. It was the proving ground. The moon was the beginning, not the end. Which is why, even in his final years, Duke's eyes turned to the horizon, to Artemis, to Mars, to the belief that humanity's next steps will make his own footprints just the prologue to a much greater story. The future beyond Apollo. For Charles Duke, the moon was never the destination. It was a stepping stone. He's said it countless times in his later years. Apollo wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning. In Duke's eyes, the moon was a test, a place to learn how humans survive in alien worlds. And now, more than 50 years later, the lessons of Apollo are fueling something bigger: the Artemis program. For the first time since 1972, astronauts are preparing to return to the lunar surface. And Duke couldn't be more excited. He calls Artemis a continuation of the promise we made with Apollo. Not just to go back, but to go further. Unlike the short visits of his era, Artemis will establish a permanent presence, bases, habitats, and the technology needed to sustain life. To Duke, that's the bridge to Mars, because in his mind, Mars is the true destination. The red planet is where humanity will prove it can exist beyond Earth, not just for days or weeks, but for generations. He believes the footprints he left in the Descartes Highlands are just the first lines in a much longer story, one that ends with colonies on other worlds. And yet, for all his optimism about the future, Duke admits something deeply personal. He knows he won't live to see it. Artemis will launch without him. Mars will be settled long after he's gone. But he takes comfort in knowing that his grandchildren and their grandchildren might stand where he once stood, looking up at an alien sky, feeling the same mix of fear and wonder he felt in 1972. That's why, in his last years, he's pushed so hard to share his story. Not because he craves recognition, not because he wants fame, but because he knows Apollo is the foundation. If future explorers don't understand the truth of what came before, then the courage to go further may wither away. Duke insists on one thing above all. The moon wasn't about politics. It wasn't about beating the Soviets. It was about showing what humans are capable of when they risk everything for knowledge. And that's the lesson he wants passed on. So, before he dies, Charles Duke leaves us with a challenge. Will we see Apollo as the end of a golden age? Or will we see it as the dawn of something greater? In his own words, the moon is not the story. It's the prologue. The real question is, do we have the courage to write the next chapters? We've heard Duke's truth, but now the question shifts to us. Should humanity focus on Mars or finish what Apollo started on the moon? Will Artemis inspire the same way Apollo did, or fade into politics and budget cuts? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because Charles Duke's voice won't echo forever, but maybe ours can. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Apollo's most overlooked legends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories that history left in the shadows.